Here's today's top story. Do computer chips actually get slower with age? The real science behind silicon aging. There is a question that keeps coming back in enthusiast circles every few years. Do computer chips actually get slower as they age? It sounds simple, but the answer is more interesting than a clean yes or no. Your old CPU or GPU usually doesn't wake up one day and decide to become 10% slower just because it's been inside your system for 5 years. In most normal cases, if an older PC feels slower, the culprit is more likely to be accumulated dust, dried/pumped out TIM, thermal interface material, background apps, operating system bloat, security patches, newer/more demanding games, or simply higher user expectations from their hardware. But that doesn't mean silicon aging is a fake story. In fact, computer chips absolutely do age at the physical level. Transistors, interconnects, insulating layers, and power delivery paths all operate under electrical and thermal stress. Over time, that stress can slowly eat into the voltage and frequency margin that allowed the chip to run reliably in the first place. I have personally seen this with GPUs over the years. Many of my graphics cards had overclocks that were stable at first, only to become unstable over time while running the same clocks, voltages, and at similar temperatures. The cards didn't suddenly become slow in the traditional sense. Instead, the headroom that made the overclock possible seemed to shrink. That's the real story of silicon aging for most enthusiasts, not a chip getting tired like an old engine, but a chip losing the safety margin that once made aggressive tuning possible. A chip usually doesn't get slower, it loses its stability margin. Modern CPUs and GPUs aren't fixed-speed components. They constantly adjust their frequencies based on power, voltage, current, thermals, workload behavior, BIOS, basic input-output system, /UEFI, unified extensible firmware interface, rules, and user-defined settings. Intel's turbo boost behavior, for example, is limited by power, current, thermal limits, active core count, and maximum frequency rules. In other words, boost clocks are already conditional even before aging enters the conversation. That means there's a big difference between the chip has aged and the chip is now slower. A new CPU might be validated to hit 5.5 GHz under a certain voltage range with enough reliability margin. Years later, that same CPU may still run its stock settings perfectly fine because Intel, AMD, or Nvidia did not ship it with zero stability margin. But if the owner was running a manual overclock, an undervolt, or simply running their chip at very high voltages/temperatures, then that reduced margin may start to matter more. Aging effectively shifts the chip's stability curve. The frequency that once worked at a given voltage may eventually require slightly more voltage. Or, if the voltage remains the same, then the chip may need slightly lower clock speeds to stay stable. What actually ages inside a chip? At the physical level, silicon aging is not one singular phenomenon. It's a collection of wear and tear mechanisms that chip designers and engineers have to account for when designing and validating chips. The main ones PC enthusiasts ought to know are negative bias temperature instability, NBTI, hot carrier injection, HCI, time-dependent dielectric breakdown, TDDB, and electromigration. A 2025 review of IC, Integrated Circuit, Reliability identifies NBTI, HCI, TDDB, electromigration, and other aging-induced variations as major reliability threats to chips as they continue to scale in terms of frequency and voltage. Negative bias temperature instability, or NBTI, is one of the big ones. In simple terms, voltage and temperature stress can gradually change transistor behavior. Threshold voltage can shift, meaning a transistor may require slightly different electrical conditions to switch as reliably as it once did. NBTI is widely recognized as a key MOSFET. Metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistor reliability issue and is associated with threshold voltage increase and reduced transistor drive behavior, as in whether it acts as a switch or amplifier in a given electrical circuit. Hot carrier injection, or HCI, is another aging mechanism. Under high electric fields, energetic carriers, tiny electrically charged particles, usually electrons, can damage parts of a transistor over time. You can think of it as the transistor being electrically roughed up by years of high-stress operation. Time-dependent dielectric breakdown, or TDDB, is more about insulating layers wearing down. This isn't usually something that gives you a graceful 5% performance loss. It's a long-term reliability mechanism that can eventually contribute to failure. Then there is electromigration, which is essentially chip wiring aging under stress. CPUs and GPUs contain tiny metal interconnects that move current between transistors, and over time, high current density and heat can physically push metal atoms out of place. This can create voids that increase resistance or break a connection, or hillocks that may short nearby structures. In enthusiast terms, it is not just the transistors that age, the microscopic wiring inside the chip can wear down too. Why chip aging often shows up as crashes, not as performance drops. The reason silicon aging is so misunderstood is that people expect it to behave like mechanical wear. An old car may lose power, burn more oil/fuel, or feel sluggish. A CPU or GPU is different. Computer chips are built around correct operation. Either a chip completes its work in time, or it doesn't. Either a bit is correct, or it isn't. Either the chip is stable under a given voltage/frequency/workload, or it throws errors, crashes the app, or the entire operating system, resets a driver, or produces visual artifacts. That's why a degrading chip often looks normal, until it suddenly doesn't. A gaming benchmark may run fine, but shader compilation may crash. A GPU may pass a light stress test, then black screen or produce artifacts in one specific game. A CPU undervolt may be stable for months, then start throwing WHEA, Windows hardware error architecture, errors. A memory overclock may pass one test but fail during a long gaming session. This is because not every workload stresses the chip circuits in the same way. This is why overclocking enthusiasts often notice aging earlier than most users. Overclocking reduces the margin between a stable chip and an unstable one. If a stock GPU has plenty of headroom, then mild aging may not be visible. If that same GPU was already running close to its stable limit, then a small amount of aging can be enough to expose instability. Intel Raptor Lake. When silicon aging became a mainstream consumer story, the best recent example of this issue hitting the mainstream PC market is Intel's Core 13th, Raptor Lake, and 14th Gen, Raptor Lake Refresh, desktop CPU instability saga. For months, users reported crashes on high-end desktop Raptor Lake and Raptor Lake Refresh CPUs. The issue showed up in games, mainly ones using Epic's Unreal Engine 5, and specifically during strenuous shader/PSO, pipeline state object, compilation/decompression steps using RAD Game Tool's proprietary UDL library. Eventually, Intel linked the problem to elevated operating voltage and what it called the VMIN shift instability. In October 2024, reports based on Intel's update said the company had identified excessive voltage and premature aging as part of the root cause, with BIOS/UEFI and microcode mitigations released to prevent further damage to the CPU silicon itself. This is exactly the kind of case study that makes silicon aging easier for enthusiasts to understand. VMIN refers to the minimum voltage required for stable operation at a given condition. If that minimum voltage shifts upward, then the chip may need more voltage than before to remain stable at the same frequency. If the system still tries to run the chip under the old assumptions, then tangible instability can occur. The key point here is not that every Raptor Lake CPU was doomed, or that all modern CPUs age dangerously. The lesson is more specific. If voltage behavior goes wrong, and if a chip is exposed to elevated voltage and temperature for long enough, then silicon aging can stop being an invisible engineering concern and become a very visible consumer problem. It is also important to remember that software and firmware mitigations cannot magically reverse physical silicon degradation. Reporting around Intel's fixes made clear that updates could help prevent future damage, but already degraded CPUs would generally need replacement rather than a miracle BIOS/microcode cure. Overclocking. Spending tomorrow's safety margin today. Overclocking is fun because it takes hidden headroom and turns it into extra performance, at the cost of extra heat/power, and potential instability. But that's also why overclocking is one of the easiest ways to expose silicon aging. A stock chip is validated to work within a defined operating envelope that takes into account voltage, current, and thermals. That envelope includes reliability assumptions. That's it for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe.